Thank you very much, Paul and Gareth, and ladies and gentlemen, young people. Good evening. It's an absolute pleasure and delight to be here among so many of you, old friends that I can see, students, professors from the university, and as I said, young people, some of whom have a very good connection with Bernardos, and I'll talk about that in a moment as well. And I'm so pleased to be in a lecture theatre that I can remember sitting here as a student once upon a time. Apparently it was double the size then, because I couldn't quite picture myself in it. It used to be much bigger. And my fondest memory is we were in this big lecture with hundreds of us in there, second year economics, I think we were being taught. And at one point the lecturer got a little bit annoyed because somebody yawned. And these things happen, you know, and you have all university students know this. But he was so upset that day, he asked him to leave. He said, if you're going to yawn in my lecture, out you get. Now, if any of you want to yawn, don't worry. Stay where you are. It's okay. I used to teach maths. I know what that feels like. So it's no problem for me at all. This subject that I'm going to talk about, the last 150 years and what Barnardos has done and how social policy has changed for vulnerable children over that period, is a subject very close to my heart. And a lot of my career has been dedicated to doing what I and others can do to alleviate some of the challenges and the plight of really vulnerable people, communities, society as a whole. But as we're in Salford, I just want to share a few other memories with you of this place before I get into some of the detail. I remember coming here probably around about this time of the year in 1981 for my interview to get a place, and it was an amazing day. It was bright sunshine, gorgeous. Peel Park looked an absolute peach. That was before the big trees that now block the views. They were babies all those years ago, and it looked fantastic. I stood up at the top and thought, this is the place where I want to come and study. Stuff Imperial and City and other places where I'd managed to get offers. So I came. Nobody though told me it was going to rain for the next 3 years. Constantly rain every single day. So if they told me, I might have reconsidered. But anyway, the rain was compensated by 3 gloriously happy years living in Castle Irwell and appreciating the nightly delights of the Pav. Remember that? And unfortunately, neither of those two exist anymore, I understand. They have gone. Nor can I see the tower block that I used to study in with the famous paternoster, hop on, hop off, lift that, and occasionally we did go to do the full loop just to see what gremlins it would bring, but that doesn't exist anymore either. I had a particularly rewarding second year in Salford because I was elected to the lofty heights of the president of the Pakistan Student Society, or PAKSOC, as we affectionately called it. And I'm really delighted to see that some of the PAKSOC committee of 1983 are in the audience today. So thank you for coming, and behave yourselves, please. As I know you can. There's a couple of photographs of me in those days. Yes, you can laugh. It's quite acceptable. On the right is me pretending to study hard, and on the left is actually a photograph we all took in our little group of the site before our first exam outside Maxwell Hall. That was, So I often look back at that and do exactly what you're doing, which is laugh. Most of all, though, tonight I want to recall our first day at university, where all the freshers piled into Maxwell Hall, and we were welcomed by Sir John Ashworth, who was the Vice-Chancellor back in 1981, and then heard from the recently graduated President of the Students' Union. I don't know if you still do that, but that was the custom. And I remember listening to the President's really confident and highly eloquent address to the freshers, and thinking, where has he got the confidence to speak like that? Now, I could never do it. And the rest, as they say, is history. I say that for the benefit of the undergraduates in the room. If you're wondering what it feels like and how daunting it must be to do this kind of stuff. Actually, if a Dumbo like me could do it, and I'm doing it today, then the skies is the limit for all of you. Aim high, you will reach it. I also want to say a particular welcome tonight to the young people from Barnardos, Salford, who are here in the audience. I hope many of you will consider to come and study in a place like Salford. You really can reach your dreams from a place like this. Well, I encourage you wholeheartedly. Now, I'm going to cover 5 areas tonight, which I hope will be of some interest to you. A little bit about me and my journey since the days of Salford. I want to share some information on Bernardos, the charity. I want to talk through the journey of Bernardos of the past 150 years, some of the significant stages. I want to examine the changes we've seen over that period to policy and practice in the social welfare of children and young people, which goes side by side of the journey of Bernardos. Come on in, you've missed absolutely nothing. Please join us. And then I want to add with a little bit about Bernardo's focus for the future, which may be of some interest. Now, as I said, most lectures at universities, are so gripping that they hold the attention of about a third of the people in the room. So the other 150 of you, please turn your phone back on. Get up and walk around, stomp your feet, yawn, do whatever you like. If it helps you stay awake, that would be good for me as well. It might keep me interested, but don't hesitate. Now, so a bit about me then. I, as you heard, studied at this fantastic university. I actually graduated in '84 and went on to become a maths teacher. And after 15 years, glorious years of teaching maths, actually, I absolutely loved that. If maths is not your favorite subject, if you've still got a problem with probability or fractions or algebra, I can offer lessons afterwards at the appropriate fee. All donated back to the university, of course. But then I went into local government, 10 years in local government in Birmingham and then in London boroughs, and then into the voluntary sector. And so I made some quite brave moves along the route. And brave and bold moves is part of career development, I think. I was talking to a large group of Bernardos staff earlier on in Bradford at lunchtime, sharing some of that story with them. And we were talking about it in the context of children and young people who need our support, who need somebody's support, and helping them develop that brave instinct, that bold instinct, where they sometimes have to really have a leap of faith and do something that they might not be expecting to do. And that's the kind of thing that I did a number of times in my career after I left Salford. But as I said, I've been driven by the focus on the need to improve the life chances of young people and their families throughout all of that. Now, I'm sure you'll all agree with me that every young person, whatever their background, deserves the chance to follow their dreams, of course. As the first in my family to go to university, and that's not unusual from certainly that era, and for some people it's not that unusual today either, but being the son of parents that emigrated from the plains of Kashmir in the late 1950s, where neither of them had been touched by the magical wand of education or any education in any language, so they couldn't read or write throughout their lives. The chance to follow my dreams is exactly what this university gave me. And that is a very significant stage of my life. So, the fact that I'm being invited back to my old university to speak today is a great honor. It really is a great honor because I owe a great debt back to Salford, I believe. Now, let's talk a bit about Bernardos. As I said, the subject of this lecture is very close to my heart. It really is a privilege to lead Bernardos, the charity. As you've heard, it's the UK's oldest and largest children's charity. And this is our 150th anniversary. It's a great landmark in our history. And with any landmark event, it's a time to reflect on the past and to think about the future, what we're going to be doing in the decades ahead. And back in 1866, a man called Dr. Thomas Bernardo felt driven to provide shelter, education, and hope to the children that society had forgotten. Dr. Bernardo set about creating what I call a social movement, a force for good that has now become part of the fabric of this great country. And over the last 150 years, times have changed, and Bernardos has changed as well to keep up with those times. In 2016, gone are the poor laws of the 19th century, the workhouses, the chimney sweeps. Everyone agrees now that children should be protected and educated, and our laws ensure that decisions are made in their best interests. But although the manifestations of poverty and desperation have changed, many of the core problems remain. So Bernardo's work is far from done. if we're really successful, we should do ourselves out of a job, really, shouldn't we? That's what we should be about. But alas, that hasn't happened for 150 years, and I don't think it's going to happen soon. Sadly, we know that in every part of the country today, there are children whose families can't look after them. Children who have been sexually abused or exploited, young people without the opportunities they need to forge the future that they deserve. And indeed, I would go further and say that although the country looks and feels very different from the 1860s, the needs of the most vulnerable children and young people are as significant and as complex as they have ever been. And I want to talk a little bit about that today. So what does the Bernardos of today look like? Well, you heard Paul share some of those statistics that you see on the screen. 240,000 children, young people, and their families, their parents, carers are being supported by us, 960 services. And it includes a whole range of services, as you heard, sexually exploited children, children in care, fostering and adoption, children with mental health issues, families struggling to cope, and much, much, much more. In fact, the demand is outstripping the resources that we have to meet that demand. And that is a terrible, terrible indictment on 21st century Britain when you think about it. This isn't 1866 anymore. Yet, this is what I'm saying to you from our day in, day out practice. We are the very largest voluntary sector employer. We're the 7th largest in terms of turnover, but we employ more people than anybody else because we deliver frontline services. So 8,500 staff, and the latest is 17,000 volunteers, going up by the day, I'm pleased to say. And as a result of this breadth of knowledge, skills and expertise, when Bernardo speaks, people listen. When Bernardo doesn't speak, everyone wants to know why. And so that adds to the privilege that I have walking in the shadows of giants, trying to get a message across to the politicians, to the media, to the think tanks, and everybody else that's interested in the social welfare of vulnerable children, to put the message across on their behalf about what works, what doesn't, what change is required. At Barnardos, we don't do the easy stuff. We support the most vulnerable children and young people in society. We support the unsupported. Now, back in 1866, Thomas Bernardo arrived in London planning to train as a doctor and then become a missionary in China. But in London, he was confronted by a city where disease was rife, poverty and overcrowding endemic, and educational opportunities for the poor were non-existent. He watched helplessly as a cholera epidemic swept through the East End, leaving more than 3,000 Londoners dead and many destitute. Bernardo also met a homeless boy called Jim Jarvis in that year, who showed him all the children sleeping on roofs and in gutters in the East End of London at that time. Shocked by this experience, he gave up his medical training and made it his mission to feed, clothe and educate as many of these children as he could. And so he opened his first ragged school, as it was known then, and home for the destitute children in Stepney Green in East London, where children could get a safe place to stay and gain a basic free education. Now, late one night, a few years later in 1874, Dr. Bernardo came across a large group of children who would then have been termed destitute. Among this group was a young lad called John Summers, or Carrots, as he was called because of his red hair. And Carrots had no father, and his mother was not able to feed the two of them. So she had told him to go out on the streets and fend for himself at age 11. But Dr. Bernardo couldn't take all the children he met back to Stepney Green. That night there was only room for 5 more children, and Carrots, alas, wasn't going to be one of them. So in spite of Carrots' pleas, he was told he must spend another night on the streets of London until a place became available. The next morning, Carrots was found dead in a sugar barrel on the street. And at the inquest, the coroner's verdict was death from exhaustion and the result of frequent exposure and want of food. This profoundly sad event inspired Thomas Bernardo, and the principle that has underpinned Bernardo's work ever since. The home in Stepney Green bore the sign, you see that bottom picture, just across the doorway, I don't know if you can read it, but it says, "No destitute child ever refused admission." He had that inscribed after the Carrots story. Now, from these small beginnings, by the time of Dr. Bernardo's death in 1905, the charity was running 96 such homes, caring for more than 8,500 children. This is 1905. So friends, Bernardo's work was radical and highly innovative from the outset. The Victorians saw poverty as shameful and the result of laziness or vice. But Dr. Bernardo refused to discriminate between the deserving and the undeserving poor. He accepted all children, including the disabled, illegitimate children, and black children, at a time when other organizations were imposing huge restrictions on who they would take. He stressed that every child deserved the best possible start in life, whatever their background, a philosophy which still inspires the charity today. Some of you may have watched the recent BBC drama series Dickensian. Anybody watch that? I mean, I was really gripped by it. In that drama series, I thought there was a really good depiction of what life must have been like for children in the 19th century. The great novels like Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, and A Christmas Carol were all inspired by Charles Dickens' awareness of the plight of children and young people on the streets of London in the mid-19th century. In those days, parents and often children worked 12 to 14 hours a day in factories. Thousands of children were sleeping on the streets every night. They had to beg to be able to eat. There was no compulsion on children to attend school. The poor laws confined the worst off to workhouses. A married couple would on average have 6 children, and one of those 6 would die before the end of their first year. Overcrowding led to desperate conditions. The population of London doubled between 1821 and 1851 to 2 million, and doubled again by the year 1900. They of course had no fostering or adoption systems for children who had no one to take care of them in those days. Child trafficking and their prostitution was commonplace, and the concept of childhood itself was very different from anything we know today. For example, girls could legally marry at age 12 and boys at 14. From its foundations in 1866 through to the year 1900, Barnardos played a crucial role in driving change during this period. Similar to today, this came in 2 forms. Firstly, we were transforming children's lives through our direct work. And second, we had a powerful impact on changes to the law and the way society saw and treated children. In 1887, for example, Barnardos introduced the boarding scheme, which was a type of highly innovative early fostering program, or for that time at least. In this context, residential homes were seen as places where children could grow up away from corrupting influences and learn to lead useful lives. Dr. Bernardo wanted to save children from a life of destitution by preparing them for employment. At the first Bernardo's home, the girls were equipped with domestic skills such as cooking, cleaning and sewing, and the boys learned a craft or trade such as carpentry or bookmaking. Pretty traditional stuff, you could say, but remember the year that we're talking about, mid-19th century. At the start of the boarding scheme, he sent 330 boys to country homes. Foster parents had to be respectable, God-fearing cottagers or working people living in clean homes. They received 5 shillings a week for each child that they looked after, but Bernardo stressed that they were not to be motivated by the greed of grain. And over time, this began to have significant influence over society's views on the social welfare needs of children and young people. In 1870, attending school became compulsory for children under 12. In 1875, the government introduced an age of sexual consent, which was set at 12. This was raised to 16 10 years later. In 1889, we got the first Act of Parliament on the prevention of cruelty to children, a really key moment, commonly known as the Children's Charter. For the first time, this meant the law could intervene in relations between parents and children. Police could arrest anyone found ill-treating a child and obtain a warrant to enter a home if a child was thought to be in danger. The Act also included guidelines on the employment of children and outlawed begging. In 1891, free education for all under 10s was introduced for the first time. And in 1908, the Children's Act of 1908 established juvenile courts and introduced the registration of foster parents. The Punishment of Incest Act made sexual abuse within families a matter for state jurisdiction rather than the intervention by the clergy. Now let's pause for a moment. As we're in Salford, a place very dear to me, let's just have a look at how things were in this city and how they have changed too. Back in the 1860s, Salford was at the center of the Industrial Revolution. A huge part of the industry here was centered on cotton and silk mills. And of course, the Salford docks were a key dockyard of the Manchester Ship Canal. And actually, I should add, on my way here in the taxi driver was very knowledgeable about this. And we were talking about the cotton and silk mills. And he says, you know why that is? He says, because it rained so much. He says, because there was so much rain. It was a really good place to do that kind of work. I'd never thought of that before. So, one justification for the rain. But what was it like to live here in those days? For many people, the answer was simple. It was really, really tough. The population of the Manchester area had quadrupled in the 19th century. The area was characterized by factories, poverty, and child labor. Records show that by 1830, there were over 560 cotton mills in Lancashire, employing more than 110,000 workers, of whom 35,000 were children, some as young as 6 years of age. And the life expectancy of a working man in Salford in the 1870s could be as short as 35. The university we're in today tells its own story of how our society has changed, and Paul was telling us about some of the recent stuff that's going on, which is very, very exciting, by the way. It opened in 1896 as the Royal Technical Institute, born out of the Industrial Revolution and the need for new skills in the labour force. The courses provided at the time heavily reflected this and the weaving industry in Salford. It taught engineering, electrical engineering and applied physics, mathematics, I'm glad to say, chemistry, building, dyeing, spinning and weaving. The picture you see there on the top right is from a sewing class in the 1930s. Today, Salford is one of the world's most vibrant and diverse communities. The university, of course, has played a central part in the regeneration of Salford, both through the new campus developments, which we can see around us, and of course the university's involvement in Media City UK, where students are taught journalism, animation, and TV documentary making. Bernardo's residential care homes reached their zenith in the 1930s. In 1933, we had more than 8,000 children living in 188 homes across the country. And as children's lives changed and society's understanding of children's needs advanced, Bernardos both influenced further changes and changed itself too. After the Second World War, for example, Bernardos began focusing more on keeping children in their family rather than taking them out and sending them somewhere else. From the mid-1950s, it developed a scheme to house whole families affected by ill health, housing problems, unemployment, and crime. The father was encouraged to find a job while the mother was taught childcare and domestic skills. The local authority then offered them housing, while Bernardos provided clothing and furniture and even a holiday by the sea. Bernardos had already complied with the spirit of the 1948 Children's Act when it became a registered adoption society in 1947. Initially, Bernardos only considered children under 3 for adoption, but as the number of babies without a home fell, the charity began to concentrate on older children too. Nowadays, Bernardo specializes in finding families for children who are difficult to place, including those with profound disabilities, including those who are in groups of brothers and sisters, and children from ethnic minority backgrounds. These 3 groups, by the way, anyone involved in adoption will know they are the toughest to place. In 1966, our name changed from Dr. Bernardo's Homes to Dr. Bernardos to emphasize the shift away from residential homes. By the mid-20th century, things were starting to change in society too. In 1946, the Curtis Report criticized the poor conditions found in many institutional homes and the general lack of training given to those taking care of children. If a child had to enter institutional care, then it said this should be in small homes of no more than 12 children and ideally no more than 8. The Curtis Report, in fact, paved the way for the Children's Act in 1948, which abolished the ad hoc arrangements for looked after children that existed since the Poor Laws of 1601, and placed a duty on local authorities to care for homeless children and those whose parents were unable to care for them. The Act established specialized local authority children's departments and stated, wherever possible, parents, relatives or friends of the family should be helped to take back a child in care. Where children could not live with their families, fostering and adoption were preferable to residential care. Local authorities were now also required to establish a children's committee too, and appoint a children's officer, the first version of the old chief education officer or director of education. This period also saw the growth of different family structures: single parents, parents of the same gender, children born outside of marriage no longer being treated as shameful as they used to be. Now, over the last 50 years, Bernardos has undergone transformational change, in line with changes in social attitudes and our understanding of what's best for children. One of our starkest shifts was the move away from building children's homes to finding children-loving families. Between 1969 and 1989, Bernardos closed around 90 homes and expanded its work in fostering and adoption services. In 1979, we opened the first adoption shop in the country, where photographs and details of children needing families were displayed in a high street shop window. The move was highly controversial at the time, but has since become common practice in fostering and adoption work through the modern online web pages and so forth. And with so many things, Barnardos was bold, it was brave and innovative. I would go far as saying where we led, others soon followed. By the end of the 1960s, Barnardos set up family centres in deprived areas, much like children's centres today. They set out to help families facing unemployment, poor health, bad housing and poverty, helping parents give their children the best chance in life. And in 1974, Barnardos set up the first intermediate treatment centre for children in custody, based in Yorkshire. In 1988, the name changed again from Dr. Barnardos to simply Barnardos, to signal the move away from the Victorian past into a contemporary modern charity. In more recent years, Barnardos has demonstrated it's at the forefront of identifying the challenges facing vulnerable children, including in keeping them safe. For example, we have more than 20 years experience now in supporting victims of child sexual exploitation and those at risk. We were the first charity to identify this and set up our first project in Bradford back in 1994. We now have 59 CSE, as we call it, CSE projects around the country supporting over 3,000 children, and that number has gone up by 50% in the last 12 months. It gives you an idea of the scale of growth. We're becoming more aware, the institutions are becoming more aware, better at spotting the signals of child sexual exploitation, and children are getting more confident on who to turn to when they need support, and the numbers are rocketing. But included in this work is our response to new threats for children, such as the risks to children from their online activity, digital dangers as we call them. We closed our last traditional style home back in 1989, and I say that because so many people that I meet and I say, what do you think Barnardos does today? And they say, oh, we run homes. That history and heritage of Bernardos is still very much at the forefront. Certainly people of my generation and older who might remember in their primary schools, sticking a penny in a Bernardos box that the teacher used to have on teacher's desk, and it was the old Bernardos home model. And so people still remember that. But actually it was about 89 where we stopped doing that. Now, through this period, we saw the arrival of some of the biggest national and international legislation that governs children's rights and welfare today. In 1989, we had the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. The UK was a founding signatory of this landmark convention, which underpins many of the legal principles governing children's rights and welfare today. The Human Rights Act of 1998 enshrined the rights contained in the European Convention on Human Rights into UK law. The right to family life, often about the right for parents and children to live together or to maintain a relationship, continues to be hugely important today. I should add that this is a good time to recall the Child Poverty Act of 2000, which placed duties on the UK government to tackle and eliminate child poverty. The current government, as some of you will know, has in fact just repealed this. Food for thought for anyone interested in social welfare policy. Finally, in 2014, the Children and Families Act extended local authorities' duties towards children with special educational needs and disabilities up to the age of 25, signalling the importance of helping young people transition effectively into adulthood. So it's clear that over the past 100 years, at least, together with the rapid transformation of society, the lives of children and how children were viewed has changed drastically. Children were no longer seen as small adults who could and should work depending on your socio-economic status. And policymakers began to understand the concept of childhood and adolescence. The introduction of the welfare state meant more public services for children and a safety net for families that never existed before. So let's come into 2016 then and look at what some of the big issues facing children and young people in the UK are today. The most striking change, of course, as you will well know, is that the internet and technology have transformed the way we learn and the way we communicate. Alongside fantastic new opportunities, this has brought a range of new challenges too. Online pornography, sexting, online grooming, just to name a few. But children in the UK today also face a range of more traditional problems. Care leavers today in 2016 are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide in adulthood than their peers. The unemployment rate for 16 to 24-year-olds as a whole is 13.7% in this country. But if you happen to be someone coming out of care, for you it's going to be about 40% unemployment. More than 9,000 children were referred to sexual exploitation services in England and Wales in the last 2 years. Around 200,000 children in England and Wales have a parent in prison. And 65% of boys with a father in prison at the moment will go on to offend themselves. Intergenerational offending. There are more young black men in prison than there are at Russell Group universities at the moment. An estimated 3,000 unaccompanied children arrive into the UK every single year. In 2015, there were 5,050 young adults in prison in England and Wales. That's over 5,000 prisoners aged between 18 and 20. 1 in 10 children in this country, aged 5 to 16, suffer from a diagnosable mental health disorder that goes undiagnosed. There's a youth offending place in prison in West London where the prison governor was telling me that 73% of the inmates there, it's the largest such youth prison in Europe, 73% of the inmates there arrive with an undiagnosed mental health issue. Most alarming of all, 3.7 million children in this country are currently living in poverty. And 60% of those children in poverty have a working parent. So this isn't just households that nobody works in. 3.7 million. Damning statistics. And just looking again at Salford today then, things have of course changed immeasurably in the last 150 years, but as in many parts of the country, significant challenges remain for Salford too. The level of child poverty is worse here than the England average, with 26.8% of children under the age of 16 living in poverty. The health and well-being of children in Salford is generally worse than the England average. This includes, for example, levels of self-harm, which we're seeing a big increase on. And the proportion of children in care is also higher than the average. As of 2014, there were 575 children in local authority care just in Salford. So challenges remain. And that's where Bernardos comes in. You know, we're currently running a number of services in Salford, I'm pleased to say. And as everyone here will surely know, as I mentioned, child sexual exploitation is one of the most significant challenges facing society at the moment. So in Salford and Manchester, the Bernardos Local Protect team works with other local agencies to help keep children safe. And this crucial work is funded by Greater Manchester Police and is an excellent example of how we work together with local agencies of sorts. Bernardos knows one of the most powerful ways to prevent harm is to help children understand the risks that they face. So our online education tool called Real Love Rocks, a name chosen by young people, raises awareness of child sexual exploitation by providing accessible sex and relationships education direct to children, parents and teachers. And it's being rolled out in primary and secondary schools in Salford as we speak. And our Salford Children's Rights Advocacy and Independent Visitor Service supports looked after children to exercise their right to be heard in decisions affecting them. This is funded by Salford City Council, and I pay tribute to them for having the vision to fund work like that. And this service also hosts the Fight for Change Council, which allows young people the space to share their views, build confidence and make friends. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm delighted to say that some of our young people working with that service are here today. So the challenges, friends, colleagues, facing the UK's most vulnerable children today are considerable, and they are just as complex. But what is different today from 150 years ago is that the government and politicians of all parties recognise that these children are their responsibility. That's not how it used to be. I would like to think that the work of Bernardos and others like us has had a major influence on getting them to this stage. Indeed, the Prime Minister dedicated his first speech of 2016 to the subject of improving children's life chances. He sees it as his role, perhaps key to his legacy even, to help lift children out of poverty and disadvantage, to give them the chance to thrive. Perhaps this is even a drive to develop a compassionate conservatism. Now, of course, I don't pretend that all the government's policies are helping the vulnerable children and young people we support. In fact, I've spoken out against a number of legislative and other changes which I don't believe are in the best interests of vulnerable children. But the important thing is that these issues are now much more in the mainstream than they ever were. We now need to make sure that these remain central to the political and public debate. And only then can we hope for us, society in general, to hold government to account for the actions it takes and those that it doesn't take. Now, part of our role, before I wind up, at Bernardos is to share our experience and the evidence of working with vulnerable children. And we have vast evidence, of course, of working with young people, with government, and to use it to influence policy. But it's also about what we can do ourselves as a leading charity. To respond to the challenges of today and prepare for those of tomorrow, we're working on a new corporate strategy which we're going to be launching next month. In fact, it takes us through to 2025. We're taking a 10-year view of what contribution Bernardos can make. We've never done this before. It's always been a 2 or 3 year business plan. We're taking a 10-year view because all of our history tells us that really vulnerable children and young people, they need a sustained long-term intervention to turn their lives around. Short-term sticky plaster interventions just don't work. And you end up having to do it again and again and again. And that's why we're taking this longer-term view. Sustainability is really key, and that's what we're committing to doing. And we're going to focus on 3 key areas. The first, stronger families. By that I mean we will help families through our early intervention services like children's services, children's centres and many others, to help parents build the confidence and skills that they need to give their children the best start in life. Just in the last year, for example, we ran close to 200 children's centres across the UK, supporting over 18,000 people within them. The second, safer childhoods. We will support children who have been sexually exploited, abused and trafficked, and those at risk. Last year, our specialist child sexual exploitation services, as I said, supported well over 3,000 such children. We opened 11 new services just in 2015, and whenever and wherever we open a new service, we find children who desperately need help. In fact, my project managers would say we're virtually oversubscribed on day one. The supply just isn't meeting the demand. And thirdly, positive futures for young people. We will provide employment, training and skill services for care leavers, for young offenders and other vulnerable young people. You'll remember I said that even back in Dr. Bernardo's day, a roof over children's heads just wasn't enough. He pioneered the work of trying to give them sustainability, teaching them the skills, and we want to hold true to that. It was all about that at that time, skills and opportunities that they needed to thrive. Sustainable education, training and employment is how we will make that happen. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to end where I began. As I said, I spent most of my career working to improve children and young people's life chances, to give them the chance to realize their ambitions. And what really drives me and my 25,000 dedicated staff and volunteers across the country is young people like those here this evening from the Fight for Change Council in Salford. They're fighting for a better future for themselves and for others too. For them, it's about making new friends. It's about building their self-confidence and self-esteem and learning new skills. But above all, it's about how they are giving themselves and their peers a voice in the future. I know they've been to Westminster, they've given evidence at select committees, they've talked to a range of MPs and policymakers, they've even talked regularly to councillors in Salford. And I can tell you, they don't duck the issues. They make life very difficult for those who are in power. And so they should. They're talking about mental health. They're talking about what they need from the education system, how they can forge a brighter future, not just for themselves, but for others too. They truly are inspirational. And ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to applaud this fantastic group of young people and the example that they set to others. Just to not make too fine a point on it, it is that work and it's those young people that brought me to Bernardos. I was very happy at Victim Support. I could have seen through my next 10 years through to retirement. They're very happy, great charity. But the Bernardos bus doesn't come along every day. And the opportunity to work on the scale that only Bernardos can operate and make the difference that I think only Bernardos can in the way that we do it is what drove me to this amazing charity. For 150 years, Bernardos has been transforming the lives of the most vulnerable children, young people, and the families in our society. We help families stay strong, we help children stay safe, and young people develop the skills and confidence they need to realize their dreams. We've been doing this for 150 years and still are today at the forefront of social change, driving advances in policy, legislation, and social attitudes. We have and continue to lead by example, and government's policy, legislation, and society, I believe, is better for it. We will continue to make sure the voice of vulnerable children is heard loud and clear in the corridors of power. And we will stay true to our founding principle to ensure that no child is ever left behind. Thank you.